As I begin this morning, I would like to just briefly comment on the outlandish idea of dismantling police departments that has seen substantial coverage in recent days. Well, there are exceptions. The vast majority of our nation's police officers are men and women of character who care deeply about protecting everyone in their communities. And they provide an essential service. A service, Madam President, that we cannot do without. The idea that any city can exist without a police force is so absurd that it's difficult to believe anyone is seriously discussing it. We absolutely need to look at policies at the state, local, and federal levels to ensure that we are holding police officers to the highest standards. And I hope we'll be having serious bipartisan discussions on these issues in the coming weeks. I know at least one Senate Republican has already introduced legislation to require law enforcement agencies to report the use of lethal force. But bipartisan discussions will not be forwarded by extreme and irresponsible proposals like abolishing the police departments that help protect our communities. And I hope, Madam President, that such proposals will not gain any traction here in the United States Senate. Madam President, we are very busy, hard at work here in the Senate. Our main business on the floor this week will be the Great American Outdoors Act, legislation crafted by Senators Daines and Gardner and others that will help address the significant maintenance backlog at our national parks, among other things. Out of the limelight, Senators will also be discussing how best to respond at the federal level to the tragedy of George Floyd's killing. And responding to the coronavirus continues to be at the top of our agenda. Right now, we're focused on monitoring the implementation of the $2.4 trillion that Congress has provided so that we can identify what more we need to do to fight this virus. Our committees play a leading role in this, and they've kept up a steady stream of hearings examining implementation and identifying next steps. This week, we have no fewer than eight committee hearings on various aspects of the COVID crisis, including unemployment insurance, a Senate Finance Committee hearing later today that I'll be participating in, reopening schools, and the federal government's procurement and distribution strategies. Now, Madam President, the Democrat leader has spent a lot of time on the floor lately complaining about what's happening in the Senate. He's apparently not happy that we're in session, and he claims we're not doing anything on the coronavirus. Well, on the first point, Madam President, I'd just like to say that the Majority Leader brought the Senate back into session because we have responsibilities that we need to fulfill. One of the issues that we have to respond to is a matter of our constitutional obligation is the issue of dealing with nominations, both to the judicial and executive branches of our government. And we continue to have to do that. There are important vacancies that we need to fill, some important national security vacancies, judicial vacancies. Last week we confirmed the Inspector General for the pandemic, somebody who was confirmed by a 75-15 vote. Now, it's possible, Madam President, that we could do those and not be here. The Democratic leader has said on various occasions he doesn't know why we're here doing these types of these nominations. Well, the reason we're here doing these types of nominations is because they insist on it. Even in cases where the nominee has broad bipartisan support, in some cases overwhelming support, we continue to have to stay here and go through the procedural roadblocks that Democrats throw up to getting these nominees across the finish line. In fact, Madam President, if you look at the historical context of nominations, we're living in unprecedented times. The Democrats have filibustered now, total, 314 nominees that President Trump has put forward. All the previous presidents combined in our nation's history, only on 244 occasions did cloture have to be invoked to shut down a filibuster on a nominee. So think about that, Madam President. In the first 3.5 years of President Trump's term, we've now had 314 nominees, judicial or executive, filibustered. In the rest of the history of the United States Senate, even if you go back and say the The advent of the filibuster is only in the last half century or so. Think about that. 244 times throughout all of the presidencies combined in our history, this president has seen his nominees filibustered 314 times. So if the Democrat leader wants to know why we're here doing nominees, that's why. We have to. It's our job. It's our constitutional responsibility. And if the minority continues to make it as difficult as they have and continues to filibuster and force the leader to file cloture on all these nominees, we have to be here to vote. That's our job, and that's why we're here. Madam President, of course, there's also the work, as I said, of responding to the coronavirus. There's also work that we have to do that doesn't stop just because there's a pandemic. If you look at the Paycheck Protection Program, when it ran out of money, it took way too long to convince Democrats to do something as simple as appropriate more funding for pandemic-stricken small businesses. Funding our government, protecting our nation, making sure these important positions in the government, as I mentioned, are filled. We just can't skip those things because of the coronavirus. And they have made it increasingly difficult, virtually impossible for us to do any of this by unanimous consent while the Senate was out of session. As for the Democrat leader's charge that the Senate hasn't been doing anything on coronavirus, Madam President, as I pointed out, that's just a simply ridiculous charge to make. Coronavirus has been at the forefront of the Senate activity since we returned in May. Our committees have held a constant stream of hearings examining implementation of the coronavirus assistance that we've already passed and looking forward to what will be needed in the future. As I mentioned, last week we confirmed the nomination of Brian D. Miller to be Special Inspector General for the Pandemic Recovery at the Treasury Department, a key position with responsibility for ensuring that coronavirus funding is spent properly. We also passed last week legislation to update the Paycheck Protection Program to give additional flexibility to small businesses. Madam President, clearly the Senate has been making coronavirus a priority. And I would argue that much of what we've already done is having the desired result. The jobs numbers that came out last week are encouraging. Obviously, we've got a lot of work to do. We have to keep it in perspective. It's no time to be spiking the football, but those job numbers were encouraging. And I think one of the reasons we had those strong numbers, Madam President, is because we have a very resilient economy, number one, but number two, because of policies that we have put in place, tax and regulatory policies that encourage businesses to invest, consumers to spend. And the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, obviously has, I think, done a lot of good out there. It's kept literally millions of businesses in business. It has kept literally tens of millions of workers employed. And that is exactly what we wanted to see happen. And those, Madam President, dollars were among the best spent dollars, I think, of all the several $1 trillion that we put out there. My state of South Dakota is a good example. We've had over 21,000 businesses that have benefited from the Paycheck Protection Program to the tune of about $1.6 billion. And I bet if you look at the numbers in every other state around the country, you would see the same thing. And it's one of the reasons, Madam President, I believe, that we're seeing some encouraging economic numbers, some employment numbers, and let's hope that we can continue to build on that. But I guess that when the Democrat leader complains that the Senate hasn't been doing anything on coronavirus, what he actually means to say is that the Senate hasn't passed another $3 trillion bill. The House of Representatives, the Democrat majority there, in a very partisan way, with zero Republican support, and in fact, some Democrats opposing it, passed another $3 trillion. Well, it's true, we haven't done that here in the Senate. It's because we don't believe we should be playing fast and loose with the American people's money like that. As I pointed out, Madam President, Congress has already provided $2.4 trillion in funding to respond to the virus, which is a staggering amount of money, equal to roughly half of the 2020 federal budget. It was money we needed to spend, and we were glad to do it. And we will probably have to spend more before this crisis is over. But we have to make sure that we are appropriating what is really needed and not mindlessly throwing around trillions of dollars. And the way we do that is by monitoring the implementation of the funding that we've already put out there, that's already been delivered, which is exactly what we've been doing. And Madam President, I have to say a lot of the funding that's been authorized, some of it hasn't even been put out there yet. The $175 billion that we've authorized to help healthcare providers, hospitals, nursing homes, those folks on the front line, only about $75 billion of that has been made available already. So less than 50% of those dollars are even out there yet. It's pretty hard to decide whether you're going to throw more money at something before you've determined whether the money you've already spent is having the desired effect and whether or not there is a need for more. So we need to see where that money goes before we decide what else we need to appropriate. Now, I've said it before and I'll say it again, Madam President, but every dollar that we provided to fight the coronavirus is borrowed money, a significant addition to an already massive amount of national debt. Now, Democrats may like to pretend that we can continue to borrow more and more money forever, but the truth is we cannot. The greater our national debt, the greater the threat it represents to the health of our economy, not to mention the future of today's younger workers. And so while we may need to borrow more money to meet our needs before the crisis is over, it's crucial that we keep that borrowing as low as possible and only spend what is absolutely necessary. Madam President, so far, the Democrats' major proposal for the next phase of our coronavirus response is a $3 trillion bill produced by the House of Representatives that mentions the word cannabis more often than it mentions the word job, which I think tells you all you need to know about how seriously some are taking this issue. If Democrats really wanted to move additional relief forward, they'd be sitting down with Republicans to develop reasonable legislation that actually has a chance of passing Congress and being signed by the President. But they're not. Instead, they're proposing outlandish, far-left messaging bills and engaging in the kind of partisanship that has become the modus operandi during this administration. And while I'm talking about Democrats' unhelpfulness, I just want to mention, Madam President, the Democrat leader's offensive suggestion on the floor last week that the judges that we're confirming in the Senate will not protect civil rights. This is unfortunately right in line with their general attitude that the only legitimate judges are Democrat judges. But it is nevertheless particularly irresponsible to be fanning the flames of division in this country right now by suggesting, untruthfully, that only Democrats' preferred judicial candidates will show a commitment to upholding civil rights. Madam President, the continued partisanship, even during a national crisis, has been pretty disheartening. But I'm a hopeful guy, and I'd like to think that at least some Democrats are more interested in actually helping Americans than in far-left messaging bills. And I'd invite those Democrats to work with us. There's a lot more that we need to do before this pandemic is over, and Republicans are committed to getting our country through this crisis and to helping Americans thrive on the other side. Madam President, I yield the floor.